Okay, everyone, hi. For this week, we're going to be finishing up Hume's inquiry concerning human understanding. So, this is actually going to be the last piece of empiricist writing that we're going to be reading for this semester. Afterwards, we're going to tackle Kant, who, in many ways, is going to be seen as sort of a synthesis of the rationalist and the empiricist traditions. And we're going to get into the details about how Kant stakes out that position next week. So, for this week, we're going to try to cover a lot of the issues in Hume's inquiry that maybe we've missed up to this point or that are emphasized more towards the latter half of the book. And so you can see the topics that we're going to be discussed on the board. We're going to talk about the free will debate. We're going to talk about this interesting section of Hume's inquiry about animals. Then we're going to talk about miracles. And then finally, we're going to talk about the form of academic skepticism that Hume advocates for at the end of the book. Um, but before we get into that, I was doing, my own research, which is related to the, stuff of this period, of course. And I came across this very, very interesting passage. Um, and I just wanted to tell you all about it because I thought it was very interesting, to think about. And basically, what it detailed is there was this follower of Leibniz named Christian Wolff. And so that's like wolf, the animal, but the German pronunciation is Wolf. And so Wolf, for the most part, didn't really have very many original contributions to philosophy. His sort of primary purpose was to systematize the insights of Leibniz, because Leibniz, unlike say Spinoza, doesn't really have like a big book where you can get like the core of Leibniz's philosophy. As you saw, we kind of had to read the Monadology, we had to read the Discourse, we had to read several small pieces in order to come to sort of like a wider understanding of Leibniz's philosophy. So this Wolff guy, his sort of central purpose in the history of philosophy is that he tried to systematize all of these Leibnizian insights and see how they all go together, right? And, of course, Leibniz, as we discussed, had some of the most conservative ideas, really, that you can imagine, right? The idea that we live in the best of all possible worlds. Well, that's saying that any ruler that happened to preside over any sort of political establishment or institution is in some way ordained by God, right? Because God created the political order of men's affairs in the same way that God created, all of the laws of nature, right? And so, you just think of this and you think that it's something that's very conservative, right? It's something that is probably going to be a doctrine that people in power are going to like, right? Um, but actually, funnily enough, Christian Wolff got in quite a lot of trouble for just systematizing these Leibnizian ideas. I learned about this by reading a book by Hegel. He's a philosopher who comes right outside of the period that we're going to read for this class. He comes after Kant. And he's sort of describing the scandal that Wolff was involved in. So I'm just going to read a little bit of it just because I think it's really interesting. Okay. So, as his, namely Wolff's, opponents could make no headway by their writing, they resorted to intrigues. They caused it to be conveyed to King Frederick William I, the father of Frederick II, a rough man who took an interest in nothing but soldiers, that according to the determinism of Wolff, so they're claiming that Wolff and Leibniz are determinists, as many people in the class also thought that they were determinists, that they had no room for free will, right? That free will is impossible, okay, and that soldiers could not hence desert of their own free will, but by a special disposition of God, the pre-established harmony. a doctrine which, if disseminated amongst the military, would be extremely dangerous. The king, much enraged by this, immediately issued a decree that within 48 hours Wolf should leave Halle in the Prussian states under penalty of halter. And so Wolf got exiled from Prussia because of his belief in the pre-existing harmony, right? And the belief that God acts for the best of all possible reasons. And so that's fascinating to me because it really just kind of shows like that it's history, reality is always more complicated than you imagine it to be, right? Um, that even this philosophy, which seems in certain ways deeply conservative, is still able to represent a challenge, right, to the existing political order, right? Enough that you get exiled from the country and that the king learns about it, right? Anyway, that's not related to Hume. I just found it fascinating. It's not only Spinoza, for example, that runs into trouble with religious authority, or Descartes or Galileo, right? That really the conflicts could emerge no matter how pious you think that your philosophical beliefs are. Anyway, okay. Now with that settled, we can move on to Hume. That was just a funny little story. You don't really need to know it for any reason. I just thought it was interesting while I was doing my research, and obviously it's relevant to this period of philosophy. Oh yeah, another thing is that Kant, the person we're reading next, he was a Wolffian. He read and agreed with Christian Wolff, and so hence Leibniz, until he read Hume. And so the Wolff-Hume connection really comes together in Kant, which is kind of how you can start to think about the beginnings, at least, of how you can start to think about how Kant is a synthesis of the rationalist and empiricist traditions, that he has these influences in Leibnizian philosophy, and he has these influences in Humean philosophy. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the remaining sections of Hume's inquiry. And so the first thing that we're going to talk about is Hume's position in the free will debate. Now, so what the free will debate concerns, obviously, is whether or not we have any substantial form of freedom, right? But really, the devil is in the details here, right? Whether or not we have free will is a question that we can only answer if we have a more determinate notion of what free will is in the first place, right? Because philosophers have a whole host of different views about what free will is, right? And so here I've just listed some language that we can use to describe different positions. Now, importantly, this language is actually not in the period itself. People of this period did not really describe themselves as a libertarian or a determinist or something like that, but this is the sort of philosophical language that you're more likely to see nowadays. And so I don't want you to be confused if somebody describes Hume as a compatibilist, for example, because that's a very common thing to do. And I've kind of gone into this the teensiest bit whenever we talked about Spinoza, but we'll talk more about Spinoza on this question too. Okay, so free will, the free will debate. In general, we think about the free will debate as involving three positions. On the one hand, there are people that are called libertarians about free will. And here, libertarian doesn't have the political connotation, right? They're not saying anything about the government or where the government should or shouldn't be, right? Because this isn't about a political discussion of free will. This is about a metaphysical discussion of free will. So what that means is that we're not interested in the sort of political institutions that emerge from this notion of free will. We're interested in trying to understand the fundamental nature of free will and whether or not it's compatible with, say, a natural scientific approach to the world, right? So this is what we're interested in with the free will debate. So libertarianism about free will, taken in the metaphysical sense, means that you believe that people are, whenever they make decisions, whenever they engage in voluntary actions, that they are undetermined by their circumstances, right? And so this is the sense of like, given everything that has transpired in my life, the entire causal sequence of the universe, right? That all can be true, and I can choose to like pick up this headset or not, right? And that this is what it means whenever I say that I have free will, is that I have the ability to decide, right? To be an uncaused cause, to be something that is not subject to causal sequences, but instead initiates causal sequences. And so this is the notion of libertarianism about free will. Now, so rather than explain the next one I have written down here, compatibilism, I want to explain libertarianism's opposite, which is called determinism. And so what determinism states is that that the nature of the universe is determined, right? And so what that means is that if the entire causal sequence of the universe is the same, right, up until the point that I make the decision, say, to lift up my headset or not, right? My idea that I have a decision that I can make is really rooted in my ignorance, right? Like the decisions ultimately are determinate. They emerge for specific reasons, right? And those reasons we can identify and explain, right? I can say like, okay, well, I chose to raise the headset for the specific purpose of making a demonstration, right? And I did that because I'm situated in the context of a classroom where I'm, expected to explain things, right? So on and so forth. And so what the determinist says is that all actions emerge as a determinate event in a causal sequence, right? And so it could not have been otherwise, right? Libertarianism about free will always says that for any action or decision, voluntary action, it could have been otherwise. I could have chosen to go out and do something else, right? Whereas determinism about free will says that it could not have been otherwise. That my action or decision is actually an event, a part of a causal sequence, and not, disconnected from that causal sequence, right? And so a lot of the times people that are determinists, they will appeal to certain scientific frameworks in order to undermine this idea about libertarianism, about free will. You might think of Descartes as someone who is basically a libertarian about free will. For every decision that we make or that God makes, we could have made some other decision with the causal sequence of the universe exactly as it is. Why? Because for Descartes, we're two fundamentally different kinds of substances, right? The causal sequences of the universe are all about bodies, right? Whereas my decision, my voluntary action proceeds from my mind, right? And so that's why your mind can be, not caused, right, by the causal sequence of the universe, but it can enter into that causal sequence, right? Whereas a lot of the other philosophers that we're examining, they're going to be this middle label that I've written here, which is a compatibilist. And so what the compatibilist says is they say to, the libertarianism person that like, yes, this notion of free will where your will is completely an uncaused cause, it's disconnected from all the other causal sequences in the universe, right? That this is completely metaphysically mysterious, right? Like if if you think about your body or your brain as a physical system, right? Libertarianism seems to suggest that you just like introduce more energy or some sort of causal sequence amongst bodies from your mind, right? And like that seems to contradict the best theories that we have in physics, right? Fundamental laws of physics about the preservation of matter and energy. And you saw similar arguments from Leibniz against Descartes from this sort of view. Similar arguments will now emerge in a more contemporary context regarding neuroscience, right? That if we understand the brain as a physical system, right, of neurons interacting, then we have to explain thought as essentially related to those brain processes, right? It can't just be something completely disconnected. What's going on in your mind can't be something completely disconnected from what's going on in your brain, right? So this sort of scientific appeal sort of seems to push uh, in favor of determinism. But the problem is that determinism itself seems like it leaves you without a very important concept, right? It seems like there's a very significant difference ethically, politically, but also in some way metaphysically between myself and someone who is in solitary confinement in prison, right? Namely, that I have a greater sphere of action than that person does, right? It seems like even like there is a significant difference. There is some notion of free will that isn't this very, very strong libertarian notion of free will. And this is really where we can see Hume's contribution, right? Hume is, I think, most typically described as a kind of compatibilist, right? Because what he's going to say is that about libertarianism, about free will, that this is like completely metaphysically spooky. Why is that the case? Well, because libertarianism about free will seems to say that there, is some uncaused substance that goes and causes things, right? But Hume asks basic questions like, how could your actions be unconnected with your motives? For example, right? If we're going to say that our action is uncaused or uncaused by any sequence of causal events in the universe, that presumably includes your motivations, right? And so that causes a big problem. It seems like that notion of free will is so strong that it becomes paradoxical, that it becomes impossible to imagine people acting for reasons, right? And this is kind of similar to a Leibnizian push against Descartes, right? But on the other hand, there are still important differences between like kind of what you might call hard determinism, which is a kind of determinism where you have no free will whatsoever, and compatibilism. Because what compatibilism says is that you can be said to act freely when your actions coincide with your desire, right? And so this isn't making a claim about being an uncaused causer or being unrelated to a causal sequence, right? It actually has an important role in connecting your action with your motivation, right? And so Hume's empiricist move is to describe free will as a kind of relationship between your desires and your actions. And this results in a view about free will that we can call compatibilist, right? Similarly, I think that both, like, if you looked at Leibniz and Spinoza, that Leibniz and Spinoza are both also kinds of compatibilists. Their formulations are a little bit different, but they essentially both agree that that we do have some notion of free will, but that free will does not involve being uncaused, right? Because for them, we are, at least in some sense, caused by God, right? Okay, so that's where Hume ends up in the free will debate. Now, for the next section, Hume talks about animals, and this really has to do with his critique of causality and the examination of causal judgments that we looked at in Hume's Fork. One of the arguments that Hume makes is that we actually begin to associate events and make causal judgments before we can reason, right? And he points to infants, for example, that infants will associate, maybe like a binky or something like that with pleasure, right? And they'll want to suck on the toy, right? And so what Hume is trying to point out is that causal judgments are actually so important to the survival of the species, right? That they actually enter in prior to and independently of reason, because our capacity to reason is actually highly variable, right? Whereas our ability to make causal judgments is something that's not variable, right? Pretty much everyone does it, right? And so Hume locates this ability to sort of make causal judgments as rooted in an association of impressions, right? And you reason by analogy. It's a form of analogy, and that's important. So, like, I see fire cause smoke, I see fire cause smoke, I see fire cause smoke, right? And in these cases, I then begin to make analogous sorts of judgments, right? So if I see a wood fire burning and I see smoke, then I might analogize to a similar situation where it's something else burning, then I would also expect smoke, right? Because I'm just associating that idea with the experience that I've already had, right? And so what Hume says in this section is that not only can you see these sort of judgments show up in children, you can also see them show up in animals. The animals engage in analogy, that they engage in sort of causal judgments to some degree. Maybe you wouldn't call them judgments, but they do make causal inferences, right? Like if you grab the leash, then dogs know a lot of the time that you're about to go on a walk, right? And Hume is saying that the source of that judgment or that inference in the dog is the same as the kind of inference that we make whenever we engage in causal judgments, right? And so what Hume thinks that this demonstrates is that, it further demonstrates that our ability to make these causal judgments and so on is actually a fact about us, right? It's an animalistic or psychological fact about us that we actually share with other species. It's not a result of our reasoning processes, right? And so this sort of further augments Hume's argument that causal judgments are a product of our culture, right? Their habits. And so the next section is about miracles. And this section is important because Hume offers basically an argument to say that we should basically never believe in miracles. And of course, this is very controversial thing to say in the period. And other philosophers, I think, struggled to say similar things in a way that is kind of more pious than Hume did. If you think back to Leibniz, Leibniz also talked a little bit about miracles, right? And Leibniz tries to sort of argue that basically every causal relation is a miracle because it's the product of pre-established harmony set up by God, right? But if you think about that for a while, that sort of has the implication that miracles, as we ordinarily think of them, as something that is outside of the ordinary causal sequence and is totally supernatural, doesn't exist, right? And so ultimately, I think that, for example, Leibniz's analysis of miracles ends up very similar to Hume, even though it's phrased in a sort of religious way. So what does Hume say about miracles? What Hume says about miracles is that wisdom is proportioning your beliefs to the evidence available for it, right? And so Hume is going to think like, okay, what sort of evidence can you have that a miracle occurred, right? And a miracle is a certain kind of causal sequence that is supernatural, right? So like when people think that like Jesus's face is like imprinted on their potato chip, right? When they claim that it's a miracle, they're not saying that there was some accident at the, production factory and they produced several million or billion even of these chips, I don't know. And it just happened that you eventually got one that kind of sort of looks like Jesus or something like that, right? That would be, I think, an example of a miracle that Hume would find interesting, right? And so, belief in miracles, right, ultimately requires quite a lot, right? Because ultimately, to believe in miracles, you have to disbelieve in the natural world, right? You have to believe that there's some events where, in the case of like Jesus's face being on a potato chip, right? That like, uh, outside of the ordinary causal sequence, God directly intervened, right? And so that's really what a miracle is, as Hume is analyzing it here, right? And so whenever we say that we need to proportion our beliefs to the evidence, then a belief in miracles for Hume is ultimately quite extreme, right? Because you require some sort of proof, not only that, whatever event occurred, whatever miracle took place, but also that your entire knowledge of causal sequences that you've received from your entire experience up to this point is wrong, right? That your understanding of the laws of the universe and your experience, which is not miraculous, right, can be disproven, right, by an event like this, right? And so Hume is sort of asking, like, okay, well, what sort of evidence can you have even that can make you sort of believe in miracles, and how strong can that evidence really be, right? And so one thing that Hume is going to point out is that virtually everything that we know about miracles occurs through testimony, right? Like, I never saw the Jesus chip, right? Some guy posted on eBay about having the Jesus chip or whatever, right? And in these cases, right, the only evidence that I have that God directly intervened to produce Jesus's liking on this potato chip is the hearsay of this person, right? And they have a vested interest in believing that, right? And Hume points out that we are sort of like, as human beings, delighted to believe in miracles, that it produces happy sensations in us. And so we're likely to believe in miracles even if we don't have the appropriate sort of evidence for that, right? And so the enthusiasm on the part of the person who discovers the miracle is even greater than our desire to believe in the miracles, right? And so every link in the chain of testimony, and obviously in this case I'm talking about a kind of silly example where Jesus' face is on a potato chip, but really what Hume has in mind are probably more ancient or biblical examples, of people sort of like writing about miracles as they were reported in whatever century, right? Excuse me, my voice is going out a little. I'll get some water. Okay. Now, so Hume is thinking about like biblical miracles, right? And part of his point is that, well, that's sort of a tradition of testimony that goes down between generations, so the likelihood of introducing new errors, right, simply goes up and up and up, right? And this is similar to like what Spinoza said in the treatise on the emendation of the intellect, where hearsay or testimony is really the weakest kind of evidence that we could have, right? Even if you directly experienced what you interpreted as a miracle, Hume thinks you have pretty good reason for not interpreting it as a miracle. But in the case where you don't even directly experience the miracle, right? You're being asked to give up all of the evidence that you've accumulated for your entire life, right? On the basis of one event that you have testimony of from other people, right? And so Hume is going to say that, you know, empiricists don't really offer a priori arguments where you're going to get a necessary and universal conclusion, right? But for Hume, you can be pretty damn certain that there aren't any miracles, right? Because that would require that you know, overturn everything that you've learned about the universe up to this point, right? It's like all of us imagine, like, if we were like the character in the movie where, you know, there's like a monster or something supernatural or fantastical or whatever, that we would be like the characters that are like ready to go, right? Like, send me to the digital world. Of course I believe in it, right? But the reality is that you should not be you're excited about the plot, right? But you don't actually have a lot of good evidence that this stuff is real, right? And so we can be nearly certain that there are no such thing as miracles. It's like as close to a universal judgment as we can possibly get out of an empiricist, is that you should not believe in miracles. And so similarly, like, one sort of argument that Hume gives towards the end, and this is really prominent in his dialogues on religion, is that sometimes we like to imagine, you know, that we can have insight into the nature of God, right? In the same way that, like, if I saw like the frame of a house and a bunch of tools around and all of that kind of stuff, then I could infer that there was somebody building a house, right? People also think that people also think that you can make a similar sort of analogy with the nature of the universe and God, right? That, like, animal species are, like, you know, clearly the result of a divine craftsman, right? Somebody that has infinitely more skill than human beings who can only make like a house or a statue or whatever, right? Think about Leibniz's argument that the machines built by God, namely biological creatures, are infinitely more complex than the machines that human beings make, because the parts of the machines that God makes, namely organic creatures, are themselves machines, right? So, like, I'm composed of cells that are composed of organelles that are, you know, and for Leibniz, this doesn't ever stop, right? And so that's why, like, for Leibniz, I'm an infinitely more complex creature than even like a nuclear weapon or, you know, something that is very, very technologically advanced, right? Because all of my parts are infinite in the same way that the whole is infinite for him. And so what Hume is saying is that, okay, well, what you're trying to do is you're trying to take the case of, you know, a human being where you can actually understand another human being's motives, right? And you can understand how a human being would make a house, right? You understand at a basic level that you lay the foundation and then you know, produce, whatever, right? And so you can have some sort of like rationally valid inference in that case, right? But we don't have anything analogous to that in the case of God, right? Like, I don't have any insight into how God created the universe in the same way that I have insight into how a builder creates a house, right? And so these sorts of judgments about God and about God's creation and about how God would create things, Hume says we have no basis for any sort of judgment about that. We have basis for making similar judgments about human beings because we can have experience, right? But God, by definition, is outside of our possible experience, right? And so we have no ability to make similar inferences. Finally, and I want to end the video pretty soon, Hume ends the book by talking about academic skepticism. And so you might be wondering, like, what is that? And basically what it is that Plato founded an academy in ancient Athens, and after Plato died, the academy sort of took a turn where they thought that Plato sort of misrepresented the essence of Socrates, right? For them, the essence of Socrates is about asking questions, right? It's about poking holes in our knowledge, right? Whereas they interpreted some of the Platonic dialogues. You might think about the middle and late Platonic dialogues, if you know what that is. If you don't, it's okay. That they basically think that Plato made Socrates know too much stuff. That instead of being about how Socrates is ignorant, right, like doesn't have his own metaphysical system, he's just trying to point out the arrogance of the people who do think that they know. They think that Plato misrepresented Socrates as knowing too much. And so they try to return to this sort of skeptical tradition in Socrates where you're sort of interrogating the basis of knowledge given in various sort of philosophical systems rather than trying to build up your own theory, right? And you could get into more details because Hume also like tries to contrast this kind of skepticism with another ancient kind of skepticism, Pyrrhonian skepticism. But I think that the main point is basically that Hume's trying to position himself as being essentially similar to Socrates, right? Socrates was well known because Socrates simply asked questions, right? Socrates would claim that he didn't know anything, right? And he would be very interested when other people would claim to know things, and he would be very happy about it, like, oh great, now I get to finally know something, right? And then he would sort of interrogate them and reveal that they didn't actually know nearly as much as they thought that they did, right? And so the Oracle at Delphi declared that Socrates was the wisest of all of the citizens in Athens because Socrates was wise enough to know what he didn't know, right? And so that's ultimately the approach that Hume is taking too, where the purpose of philosophy should be to sort of free us from a kind of superstition or vanity that's likely to emerge whenever we sort of overestimate the capacity of our own powers, right? And rather than modestly assessing our capacity to understand things, we instead make these very robust knowledge claims, right? Like, obviously thinking about Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, all of them claim to know the essence of God, right? Whereas for Hume, that's just, an example of human arrogance, that's not the sort of thing that we can have experiences about, and so it's not the sort of thing that we can make any sort of reliable inferences concerning. So a philosopher who's really concerned with wisdom should just sort of be ambivalent on the matter, right? That it doesn't really matter these sort of metaphysical disputes because there's no way that we could even discover a method for assessing whether they're right or wrong, right? And so this is where Hume sort of leaves things. He has this really great passage at the end of the book, which I'll read to you because I really like it. He says, quote, "When we run over libraries persuaded of these principles, what havoc must we make? If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance," so divinity, religious text. In school metaphysics, he means scholasticism. So the kind of philosophy before modern philosophy. So we take either of those. For instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? So is it math? That's question number one. And he says no. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matters of fact or existence? So is it based in experience, right? And in this case, he says no. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. So, in other words, the only two things where we're not submitted to sophistry and illusion is in mathematical reasoning and in empirical reasoning. And this is, I think, a really profound statement of empiricism, that any more substantial claims than that risks becoming a sort of abstract metaphysics that is completely useless for the purposes of knowledge. Okay, this is the last week on Hume. I hope that you all enjoyed it. I can't wait to hear from your reading responses. I hope you all have a great week.